Well, Hub family, welcome to episode 7 of the Hub, All Things for Us with Devon Reynolds. I want to introduce y'all to one of my skills that you didn't know I had. The first step in change is to take notice, to realize the real games that they tried to show us 300 million plus years of them cold shoulders, yet 300 million of us got no focus. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's from a very famous artist, rapper, actor, activist named Joey Bad. I can't say his last name, go look him up. And it comes from his song called Land of the Free, one of my favorite songs that I believe people of African descent should know about. And it explains a lot of the issues and challenges for people of African descent in this country. If you live in places like the hood, if you live at the bottom of society, that song is for you. And it paints a broad picture of what it's been like and how we should move forward from some of the oppression that we've seen in this country. Now, before I step back, I want to turn around and show y'all something. You see what's behind me? There's a reason why I have this set up. If you take a look closely, I want you to look at it. There's a horse, and then there's a man on top. But did you notice something about that man? It's a brother with dreads, right? Like you can see, the brother got dreads. It's a black man on top of a horse. Now, when I first saw this in Richmond, Virginia, I was walking along the sidewalk. I looked up, I said, man, this is cool. Because everywhere else, when you walk around, you'll see Robert E. Lee statues. You'll see Stonewall Jackson statues, Confederate leaders that remind us of a time in history that wasn't for people like us. But when I see this statue, it gives me a glimmer of hope. It shows me how far we've come and yet how far we still have to go. And so this is one of the markers of history that I think as we drive around our cities, no matter where you are, you can be in California, Pennsylvania, no matter where you reside in the United States, sometimes I think we miss it. It's Joey Bad, his last name I can't say, but as he said, yet 300 million of us still have no focus. States and cities set up markers of history intentionally for a reason. One, to preserve and remind us of certain things. And so this I saw on my own accord, and I said, man, this is dope. But I also want to show y'all something else that I thought was really cool. Come check this one out. And here it is, family. This one behind me, if you check it out, I want you guys to read the top of the sign. It says, beneath this old gas station, that billboard in I-95/64 is Shockoe Hill African Burying Ground, active 1816 through 1879. So family, I had the amazing opportunity to sit down with the defenders for freedom, justice, and equality. And this organization did a reclamation project. And a part of that project was finding those historical markers and sites that were a part of people of African descent, a part of a history and a lineage of black culture. And this was one of the places in doing that reclaiming that they found was a historical site for black people. And so this land, this old gas station, right, was where free and enslaved Africans were buried, right here on this land. There's rocks. It's not too far from a historical neighborhood called Highland Park, which is also the hood of Richmond, Virginia. And there is also a highway next to it, which tells us that it had limited value for where they were placing many of our ancestors, many of those people of African descent. So family, why is this significant? Why is this important? Well, if you all recall in 2020, when George Floyd had been tragically murdered by Minnesota police, there was this outcry for justice. People started to look around them. There was this focus. And many people saw that in their cities, in their towns, there were markers of things that didn't symbolize the progression that many people of African descent want to see. And yet they really pointed us toward a marred past with many of those white historical figures who are a detriment to our very existence. So in looking at all of this, family, I got to sit with this organization. I got to sit with a woman by the name of Anna Edwards, who is one of the founders. And she explained a lot of the work that they do. And today's episode will be not just about the markers, but overall the work that they do to contribute to social justice and the progression and the empowerment and transformation of our people in this country. So without further ado, I want you guys to check out this next show. Check it out. So Anna, before we get started, how are you?
I'm well, and I'm
Yes.
really glad to be having this conversation.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you for joining me.
Yeah.
So I gotta really say this. There was a few things that struck me about the organization, but first, I want to tell you guys how I got connected. So my initial curiosity came. I was driving in Highland Park, which is a historical neighborhood here in Richmond. Down the street, there is a huge kind of, or well, small building, but there's a bigger street, and on it says African burial ground. And so it struck my curiosity because I said, man, right here next to what is supposed to be the hood of Richmond, you see this big sign that has this history with dates. And it struck my curiosity. So I looked around, I did my research, and I called and I said, okay, who is in charge or behind this? And I finally got through and I got to speak with you.
Mm-hmm.
And so through that channel, there was just so much more layered to the work that's being done with this organization. And I'm just excited and thrilled to not only talk about this, but to also share something that I think can be beneficial in many different cities across the country.
Mm-hmm.
So number one, could you just talk about the work? What is it that you guys do and what are you about?
Yeah, sure. So, the Virginia Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality started off as 8 people back in 2002 who were principally interested in the prison abuses in the prison system and in Richmond City Jail in particular. And we helped a few people who had family members who were incarcerated, but also serving time in what they used to call solitary confinement, and ought to still call you solitary confinement, but tend to refer to now as administrative housing. And to help them deal with those grievances, but to bring attention to those issues in the public realm. So rallies, demonstrations, protests, making it an issue, making it so that the news would cover it. Because oftentimes news media won't cover concerns by people who are within the system, right? So over the course of doing that and then sort of consolidating as a group, deciding to become a group to like continue this work, we also found that people are just really have a hard time understanding sort of the connections between specific social concerns and national politics, right? And at that moment, the issue was that the United States was about to invade Iraq. And at the local level, we don't tend to talk about that stuff, except, whatever we saw in the news last night. And so we follow the rationale that we're given in the news that night. And so we also tend to think that it's hard to understand or it's too big for us to be concerned about. And so part of what we wanted to do was to demonstrate to people that all of this stuff was understandable and that you can have an impact on it by really understanding it. So we used to do public forums.
Wow.
And so those public forums always had the issue as it existed in the present moment in the location, but then we had a speaker who would also give historical context to that situation. And then we would have somebody who would talk about how can we use that knowledge to better the community that we're in. So always making those connections became kind of a hallmark of the Defenders' work.
Wow. And so listening to kind of the origin stories, and I did a little bit of research, and of course you guys kind of have hands in many different things. One of that was, I don't even want to call it the reclaiming project.
Yeah.
In a sense, you guys were looking for markers of Black history.
Yeah.
And really African history. And
yeah.
so how did that come about?
Yeah.
How did that work start for you guys?
Sure. Well, like I said, the public forums, the historical context piece, right? So it's like understanding the prison system today, you go back. How did it get started, And so as we went back to unpack that, we were making a connection between the story of Gabriel's Rebellion, the history of Gabriel's Rebellion here in Richmond, Virginia, and literally the creation of the state police. Right. So and they still, I think, call themselves to some degree the Capitol Police.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So I think they were called like the Capitol Patrol back in 1800 when they were created as either 1800 or 1801. And it was literally in response to the fact that Gabriel's Rebellion demonstrated that enslaved and free Black people would organize and could rise up and were a threat
right? So we talk about, the cruelty and the violence perpetrated against Black people in order to keep them enslaved. We shouldn't be shocked by this. We can be shocked at, what that actually means for people, right? Because it's always shocking and it's always horrible. But at the same time, there is no slavery, period, without violence. Like, it can't happen. People do not voluntarily step into enslavement, right? So it requires it from minute one. And so that means that Black people were always going to be a threat because they were going to resist that violence, right? And either by removing themselves, either by thwarting the authority, or by trying to end it altogether through these various forms, including active and violent resistance, right? So, so when we started telling the story of Gabriel's Rebellion, it was a local story because it took place here. So we could take people to the places where Gabriel had walked, where his fellow conspirators had walked. We could talk about what life in Richmond was like in the 18th century, in the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution, which we all totally take for granted that we understand what happened and what it was all about. And it's a much more complicated thing because the people who were involved at every level, whether they were conscripted or volunteered, whether they fought on the side of the British, and if they were Black, anticipating that they would be liberated, from slavery, whether they were an elite slaveholder or a shopkeeper or an import-export person. I mean, everybody of every walk of life makes up the context in which people have to move around and get things done, right? Exactly. So we were trying to sort of bring that to life in order to understand what it was that Gabriel's Rebellion actually meant and continues to mean, in spite of the fact that the rebellion itself didn't actually get to happen, right? Yes. So getting involved in that story and then being connected to a historian who had been doing research of the city of that and the city of Richmond, and identified the burial ground, the first African burial ground that was what they called the burial ground for Negroes. It was the first city cemetery for the burials of Black people in the city of Richmond. And that existed from 1799 to about 1816. Back in 2002, 3, 4, we didn't know that. So there still hadn't been enough research done to know that kind of specific detail. But we knew it was the earliest one. And at that time, we also were given to understand that a gallows had been built there and that was where Gabriel had died. That's where he became a martyr to the cause. That's where he became our ancestor. We now know that it probably wasn't there. But it was another gallows in another part of Richmond, and actually closer to where the first state penitentiary ended up being built. So just a little bit west of the location that we understood at that time. But all of that is to say, by digging in and trying to understand the history of Gabriel's Rebellion and how it took place in this city, and what Black life was like in this city at that time, it began to resonate with people. I will say it helps us sort of connect to the present, right? We have a sense of the Civil War and emancipation. We have a sense of Reconstruction and Jim Crow and segregation and the civil rights struggle. But we don't really sort of go back. Like, we just go like, that was the period of slavery, and slavery was just this, hard thing that people had to deal with. But we don't sort of go into the details of what it meant to be Black, to be either enslaved or free, to have free and enslaved people in the same family, to be in a family that is spread out across slaveholding households, labor camps, right, industrial workers, to constantly have your eye on self-preservation, but also the life your children might have, right? And then just carving out your day-to-day experiences with people, your day-to-day relationships, right? So we wanted to make it as complicated as that. We want people to think deeply, about all of that in order to have a stronger sense of what it was that somebody like Gabriel and his friends and colleagues, when they decided that they were going to organize and try to lead a slave revolt, they knew they had decided it was worth it. They had decided that the system was clearly not going to change unless they forced it to change. So you could
if we're thinking about that and talking about that in that moment, and getting into the weeds of it, right? Then, and then understand that we're living in the weeds of the moment that we're in right now,
Yes.
and make that understandable and see that there's some kind of continuity, that there are connections, right, from past to present, and that we can connect to it, you know, because we all think differently. We were talking off camera about how we may all speak English, but there's a whole lot of different English out there,
Yes.
And we don't always hear the same thing, right? And so it became really effective to try and find as many ways as possible to connect people to the issues of the day by going back to the past,
Wow.
by going across the Atlantic Ocean to Africa, by talking about your own personal experiences, and pulling all those dots together. And so at the end of the day, and I'll just sort of shortcut this, at the end of the day, it resonated so much with people that we had 200 people come to a symposium and unveiling of a first historic marker on the site of the first African burial ground. And after that, we decided this is really a thing. This clearly is ringing people's bells in some kind of way. So we decided to formalize that project, and we called it the Sacred Ground Historical Reclamation, reclaiming, right, that project. And it started simply as, we're going to tell Gabriel's rebellion, and we're going to tell the story of this burial ground. And by doing that, we're going to bring people, into this. And it worked. I mean, it was like, it seemed somehow to be exactly the right time for a project like that. And then your encounter, the encounter that got you connected to us, is actually with what we sometimes have to refer to as the second African burial ground, only because when this first one closed in 1816, and really because the conditions down there were really not very good, the creek was right there, and it would flood, and it didn't have solid boundaries, and it was just not a well cared for spot, and it wasn't a well selected spot, not for respectful burials. So when it closed in 1816, it was because the free Black community had actually petitioned to have it closed, and then a new one was opened up just a little bit north and up the hill, close to that Highland Park area. And so what you encountered was, a whole other story, right? And the gas station that has been painted with the beautiful red, black, and green on all four sides, and then acts as a historic marker because it gives you the facts. Here lie 22,000 people in that cemetery over a 60-year period during slavery and after, during emancipation.
So many questions.
Yeah, good.
So many questions. One, this stuck out to me as you were talking. You're talking about reclaiming.
Yes.
And then I think of the issues around critical race theory.
Yeah.
And how in schools there are certain subjects or things about history that the government or whoever the powers that be don't want taught. And so doing work like this, how significant is it, especially during this time, to make sure that these stories are told and that really realities are elevated?
Right. So while out there in the media world, right, and we dump on the media, and then we celebrate the media at the same time, right? Because we need that. We need the press, as it were. But the thing is that what we are teaching is history, right? So all of the sort of politicized conversations about curriculum and policies and things like that, we have to pay attention to that. We need to understand what they're doing and why they're doing that, right? So if they're trying to limit it, then they're scared about something, right? But our position, teachers, historians, everybody who's teaching history, who's teaching literally just the systems and how they work, we're going to get to those truths. So we're teaching historical, and we do it from the documents. We do it from the historical record. We do it. What is interesting about this, what appears to be an attempt to, either whitewash history or whitewash Black history, or as you might put it, whitewash white history. If all of that is
is trying to sort of reduce it down to a controllable story, right? Some kind of narrative that needs to be controlled in order to produce, people who think in a particular way. And of course, that doesn't work because humans have curious minds, right? And so as soon as what's in front of you doesn't line up with what you've been taught, you start asking questions. And so it's imperative upon us, and I'll even say it this way: it's imperative on, as you think about people growing up, it's imperative on the adults that young people are looking to teach them what they need to know to come along.
Yes, yes.
To not present nonsense. Not present them with things that can be very easily challenged, that they will encounter so quickly is not true. That they will then begin to mistrust the adults in their lives. And then they have to rely on each other, right? And begin to imagine that adults are not trustworthy.
Yes.
And that's dangerous for society, that's dangerous for families, that's dangerous for all of us, because this is how we pass on our knowledge. This is how we pass on what we know and what we've learned. And so it's really important that we not be intimidated by any of that and continue to teach what we know. And don't mythologize. Don't do that. Don't make it up. It's so important. Don't make it up. If you hear something that you find amazing,
yes,
go dig a little bit more. Go back it up. Right?
Yeah.
Get excited. Maybe that thing you heard, maybe it was from a movie that's entirely fiction. And you're like, that can't be true.
Oh my.
Right? So then go find out.
Yes. One of my, and I just shared is when I went to South Africa, the movie Shockoe.
Yeah.
You seen it? And
a long time ago.
Long time. So watching that movie, I was captivated by seeing African culture on the screen, because that was giving me a peek into the window of what life was like once then. And when I went to South Africa, I went to the community of Soweto, and I spoke with someone in the community who was Zulu. So I told him I was all excited. I'm like, hey, I saw Shockoe Zulu. These are questions I have. I'm all excited. And then he looks at me with a smile on his face. Yeah, that movie wasn't right. And so my mind goes towards, this is how I kind of think of a lot of the things that we're learning, the stories that people are telling. Sometimes they don't have that validity or the right information or facts around it. And looking at the Shockoe Zulu piece, there were just encounters in the movie that happened to where I thought were true, and I was sharing it with everybody. And he's like, no, those are wrong. I'm Zulu.
Didn't happen.
Didn't happen.
It was a good story, but it didn't happen.
And I think of critical race theory and just a lot of the removal of very much integral parts of history that need to be told. And so, did you have? I'm sorry.
Well, I'm just gonna, because as soon as we say critical race theory and we don't say what we mean by it.
Yes, I'm sorry. I apologize.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
She's right.
Yeah.
Yes. I have a second question.
Yes.
When I saw the African burial ground, the word African being used, was that intentional?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and it's a really good question to raise, even if it seems obvious to people. It's like, of course we're going to call it African, right? But that was a contemporary decision, right? And I know that when we did that with the Shockoe Bottom African burial ground, because we're talking about the two different ones, right? So Shockoe Bottom and Shockoe Hill. And so in Shockoe Bottom, back in 2004, when we chose the name of our group and when we began to promote the story, we also then very quickly ended up having to literally defend the site from being destroyed, because there were development plans, and they centered around putting a baseball stadium down there and luxury condominiums and retail shops and all that kind of stuff, because people were looking for, how do we boost the economy in the city of Richmond? And we know that that's a challenge. And we know that the poverty rate was in excess of 27% at that moment. So people were like, we got to do something. And so we understood that. But at the same time, there were other places where things like that could be done. And this place was revealing itself to be a really critically important historical site that had been entirely underappreciated. And also in the moment that it was sort of becoming sort of unpacked in public, and we were learning about the role that Richmond played in the domestic slave trade, it became not just historically significant for Black history, it became a unique, significant site for Black history and American history, because Richmond was acknowledged by historians who studied and have been writing about slavery to be one of the key epicenters of the exportation of African descended people from the East Coast plantation culture into the Deep South after the United States acquired the Louisiana Territory, right? So you had debates about there's too many Black people here. Look what happened in Haiti. We may need to think about how we end slavery, and then where are we going to send all these Black people? Because we didn't really envision this place to be a multiracial democracy. We weren't really, it wasn't quite the image we had in our heads, right? And so all of that conversation is literally going on. And then we acquire that territory, and unfortunately it's like, yeah, but Haiti won. Yeah. And then France sold off what they couldn't afford to keep anymore.
Yes.
So then the United States expands, and suddenly they don't have too many Black people anymore for the labor that they now need in the Deep South. So we're not going to end slavery. We're just going to start this process of moving people to where we need the labor. So Richmond ends up, over the 30 years growing up to the Civil War and during the Civil War, becoming one of the principal or sort of the largest operating slave trading marketplaces, yes, right? So it's not one auction block, it's not one, shop, it's not one, public market. These transactions took place in hotels, on the corner, in small businesses, in large businesses. This was the place. And it wasn't the only place. We're only just saying that Richmond was like one of the most important at that time. But that means if that was number one, then there was number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They were all functioning and all here on the East Coast to funnel people into the West, right? Okay, so with all of that going on, I kind of forgot the original question, but yes, if you remember it.
No. So the word African just being intentional.
Yes, right. Okay, so I'm so glad you got because I traveled. So we're absorbing all of that history, and we are looking back to a time when this burial ground was created by the city of Richmond Town Council, and they pick a site that is on a hillside adjacent to a creek that floods every year. There's no fence, there's no articulated boundary. The records, to the degree that any records existed, because again, Richmond was a very, very young city at this point, to the degree that they had processes in place to record Black burials, much less all white burials, right? We don't have those records. Those records are gone, they're lost. So, and then we do know, because this was a surviving document, a man wrote a letter describing a petition that had been submitted to the town council that they wanted to close this site and give us a new spot because this site is horrible. Not only is all of what I just described sort of environmentally happening, but also they built a gallows. The letter that was written in 1810, I think, 1810. So he says there's a gallows on this site, and so criminals and unrepentant sinners are being executed here. This is not a cool site. And so there was an open acknowledgement of that, and it included a physical description of the site and how there weren't any of these boundaries, and they didn't always know if they were burying people on private land or public land or whatever. This needed to go. So we're looking at a site that Black people didn't control. So bring it all the way up to 2004, and when we start talking about this place, we look at the map from 1809, which is the only map that actually describes the existence of this burying ground. Yes. And it refers to, the labeling on it is burial ground for Negroes. So that's a descriptive term. That whole sentence there, that whole title, is clearly the map maker's descriptive term from their perspective. This is a white, this is a white system. It's a white surveyor. And he lives then, and people are called, well, Negroes is not bad in of itself. I don't mean that. But that's their name for this place. And since they weren't giving this place any real respect anyway, as we were elevating the story of the existence of this place, so it may have been a bad spot, but people were buried there, right? So to demonstrate respect for those people, we also looked to how Black people of that era named their own institutions. So when they organized and named their churches, right, or their societies, they always used the word African. So on their behalf, in this moment, we said, this is an African burial ground.
Wow.
And that's what we're going to call it. And we had there was no pushback. No pushback. And again, there was something about the 2000s where really, in many ways, around the country and around the world, people were beginning to intentionally, seriously examine the history of Black life, the history of our sites, and the way in which economic factors like historical tourism were providing resources for people to begin to unpack this history and say, oh, come see our town. We have this story to tell now, right? And at the same time, you have Black family genealogy becoming a profession.
Yes.
And pushing on the archives and pushing on scholars and pushing them because they're asking questions, trying to connect families. And so they're encountering the same challenges that historians have been challenged with, in that you can't get to the archives, it's either far away or you have to be a member, or it's only for, graduate students, and yet people want to know. And so they're starting to use the tools that they have available to them. And for a lot of people, it's churches, it's cemeteries, it's funeral programs. It's, when you start thinking about the ways in which, that information is collected, right? How many resources we all have, in our boxes of stuff, at home that we just think about this old stuff that maybe I need to go through, like 1,000 Christmas cards. Yes. I need to just throw away. And yet, if you were asking the question, who was Uncle, Joe married to in 1924 versus, Annie Jane, right? And then suddenly the Christmas cards become, wait a minute, who was that from, when I got it that year? So suddenly they become part of an archive that sort of gives you information. But all of this, everything that I'm saying right now is really back to that question of, this was a moment that our work began, and it seemed to be in a moment when all of this began to matter more and more to people. So people weren't as dismissive as they might have been 10 years before that, saying, well, that's interesting for you, right? But, big deal. But now people are like, the historical societies are starting to pay attention now. We're starting to see news stories. People are making documentaries and movies, right? And it's just really, and then social media and the internet and all these things are beginning to sort of really push these things out there. And so people are finding their people. They're finding ways in which to sort of fill back up with respect.
Yes.
Right, for the history, for for their effort, that this effort actually matters in this moment. I may be looking back 200 years or 90 years, but what I'm finding out about that is empowering this moment.
Wow. And that's the piece I wanted to kind of touch on. There's a saying in South African culture, specifically Zulu culture, where they say Maya Gule, which means all that is ours will be ours again. And I think about this conversation and the work that's being done, even in African culture. The past is not something that you just leave behind, but it's really a marker for the present. So we continuously learn from it. We pull on stories. I think of oral tradition, how stories were passed down through generation after generation. And when the slave trade happens, all that gets cut off, and no longer can they touch back towards what was learned from the past.
Yeah, and not in. And even as that happens, somehow Black people still, live and breathe, but they still live and breathe many of the connections that were built into them from that, right? So no, I don't know the name anymore, right? But for some reason, I make my food like this.
I got chills in my bones because I've said this time and time again. Yeah. You look around at some of the things that people build institutionally, just the callings that people have, the things that Black people do in this country.
Yeah.
It's something is there innately
Yeah.
inside of us.
That's right.
That is forcing us and
That's
pushing
right.
us. We don't even know
Yeah.
exactly
Yeah.
where it comes from.
Yeah.
And that's a huge part of the conversation. I spoke with Dr. Cornell West recently, and I was just asking a question. I want to ask you the same because I think it's important. There seems to be this sort of lackadaisical attitude towards our history and even a fight for social justice now. And so a lot of folks may look at this and say, well, this doesn't concern my everyday living.
Sure.
But
sure.
Clearly.
Sure. You know, and we are, you know, what flips my switch is not the same as what's going to flip somebody else.
Right, exactly.
Right. And so that's cool. So I live in a world where anything historical, I'm an Energizer bunny is like, you know, flash a shiny thing about history and I'm like, I'm off and running. So that's what gets me, right? And that's what helps me connect, right? And when in class, when we're talking about, you know, all these different things, and I ask the students, I was like, well, you know, what are your majors, or what do you think you're going to major in? And, you know, we got people in all kinds of things, from, you know, mechanical engineering to sociology to political science, criminal justice, nursing and pre-med, and, you know, so they're in English literature. I mean, you know, they're all these things. So what is each of them saw something in learning about African American studies or learning about the history of race and racism that they thought would be interesting, is usually the word, right, to start with. But as we go through the class, they say, aha, that's where this thing in my field comes from, right? So how do these historical things help me understand the present moment of the field that I'm actually interested in? I mean, I was trying to tell somebody, it's like, okay, if history is what turns me on and accounting is what turns you on, I know there's a story in accounting.
Yes.
I know there's a history to that field.
Right.
I know that accounting has been, I mean, how many gangster stories center on the fact that the accountant decided that they wanted out? It either went really well or it went really badly. Right? But because the accountant's the one with all the knowledge about the money and how it comes in and out, right? Yes. So that's an understanding about economy, right? And that's part of the story. It is. That's going to be found in this. So it's just to say that you will find the thing, and people are going to come to what connects them enough to make them want to do something for the idea of social justice, you know, on their own. They will. We continue to do what we do, and they will find those connections. Right. But we also have a responsibility for making sure that those connections are as easy to identify as possible.
Yes, yes. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you just to tell a little bit of your story. And I would love to hear just the origins of how you got into the work that you're doing now, but also as a professor. How did that start for you?
What's really becoming interesting to me is, again, how each phase of my life somehow, you know, just again, always takes me back to sort of historical dynamics, right? So here I am teaching Introduction to African American Studies, and African American Studies was happened in 1968. That's when the first Black Studies program was created, and there were a handful of key universities, Black students, and actually mixed groups of students who were pushing for Black studies. So it was an interestingly multiracial venture in some ways, but principally we're talking about Black scholars, Black students, and Black community activists who bring this into being. And in 1968. Well, in 1968, I'm a 8-year-old little girl living in Los Angeles, and my aunts and uncles and friends are either going to UCLA, which is one of the universities that's part of that origin story, or are just, you know, young people moving around, and they're either, you know, doing civil rights stuff, or they're doing art, you know, work. Working in 1968 as a Black person in Los Angeles, you know, is a thing. So I'm sitting here realizing that my aunt worked for the Center for Black Studies at UCLA the year it was created. And I was talking to my uncle the other day, and he's like, "Oh yeah, we were there. I mean, we were there. We were part of it, right?" So I'm a product of a black man and a white woman who found each other in art school at USC.
Wow.
So I grew up in what we thought was this growing multiracial climate in Los Angeles of the 1960s, right, and 70s, as the movement, the Black Liberation movement, is going on, and the anti-war movement, anti-Vietnam War movement is happening, women's rights, gay rights, indigenous rights, the American Indian movement is coming. I mean, so the world is just popping all around. But I'm just a little girl growing. I'm just a little girl. Daddy's a little girl, mommy's a little girl. I have two sisters. My uncle got cousins, and we're just doing our thing as kids. But this is what's swirling all around us. So I just do like everybody else does. I don't pay much attention, but I'm growing up in that world. I'm feeling those influences. I go through the 80s. I go to art school eventually. And then I practiced art, but not really. And then I found my way to New York, and then I found my way to Richmond, and some of that involves school, some of that involves marriage. I spent probably, until I was in my early 40s, I was a landscape designer and yard person. I did deconstruction, we call it demolition. I did demolition as a teenager.
Wow.
I worked for a real estate agent who was also a motivational speaker. I worked for the United Way. I was a secretary for an architecture and engineering firm. This is just me getting jobs. But after a while, I began to realize that I was really absorbing a lot from each of those jobs. I mean, even working for the Five and Dime, and in a sandwich shop when I was in college during my work study, right? So, and every one of those jobs exposed me to people and settings that I didn't know was going to prove to be so interesting and so helpful until later. And it isn't until I moved to Richmond and was divorced, had a child, or the other way around. And then, anyway, I got two boys now who are grown men. So, but it wasn't until sort of this next phase of life, right, after all of that, that I was like, I want to do something. I don't know what I want to do. And one of the most influential things that happened was that I came, and I don't remember how I found out about it, but an anthropologist who was teaching in the early African American Studies department here, in the late 90s, Audrey Smedley, was giving a lecture because she had just published her book, and it's called Race in America. And I sat in this lecture, and she was the person who introduced me to the story of Gabriel's Rebellion.
Wow.
And she was talking about Gabriel's Rebellion as being a tipping point event in the need to create the construct of race in the United States in order to justify slavery, and particularly the enslavement of Black people for that purpose, right? And she got through talking, and I remember that I was like physically shaking, but I wasn't shaking with fear or rage. I was shaking with excitement, because she had put words to feelings that I had had as in my, over the course of my 42 years at that point, right? Or 39, I guess it was 39. The things that I had been observing about people and their interactions with each other, and seeing racism and seeing classism and seeing, Mexican people, working with Black people, and Scandinavian white people versus German white people versus English white people versus Spanish white people. And sort of, it's like, I'm just like, the world is a really interesting place because people are really interesting and they all come from their own stuff. And so much of it seems to collide here, at least because we're here in the United States. So it's that story here where everything is sort of swirling. Anyway, I remember I was like, I fangirled her. I didn't know how to talk. I was just like grinning and walking behind her. And so, that, and then meeting somebody else who knew about Gabriel's Rebellion, and then meeting the man who ended up becoming my next husband was an activist and had been an activist since the 60s. And so the experience of getting involved in prison justice work,
Just being exposed to the present moment right then, and how the historical context just directly fed. It's like, oh, this is happening because of that,
Right.
and I can see the thread.
Yes.
And things just became visible in a way. And so it really wasn't until 2016, well, it's about 2014 when I decided that something about this work I was doing, and also telling, because as soon as we would learn it, we would tell it, because that was part of the Sacred Ground Project's purpose.
Wow.
Was to do public events, do tours. I ended up, and again, because the context of the things were changing and the universities were paying attention, so I started getting invited to present at conferences or in teachers' classrooms and things like that. And so I finally realized that what floated my boat more than anything else was the sharing of this history and helping people see the connections between things.
Yes.
So 2016, I decided to go back to school and got my master's in history in 2020, and went to work for the American Civil War Museum, which was another whole education in and of itself.
Oh,
and then was approached about teaching at VCU in 2023, and so I've really just been here a year.
Wow, wow. So in your story, for one, this is another inspirational pieces in here as well, right? It's never too late.
Never too late.
Never too late. And finish what you start.
Yeah, right. Or you go back to it.
Go back to it. Yes.
Because the first time I went to college, it was for art. Mm-hmm. And that was extremely helpful and educational. And it helped me understand my parents a little bit, right? Because they're both artists. My uncle's an artist. But I could do it, but I didn't give it what it needed. If I was going to be a real artist in the world, right, then there's nothing else to do. You just do that. And for some reason, it didn't hold me that way. And so 30 years later, when I went back to school, I initially tried to go back to finish. I said, let me get the master's in art, because that's what I started. But my application wasn't good enough, and the work wasn't good enough. Yes. And so I was like, they were like, no. And I was like, oh, that hurt. So 2 years later, I realized it's because what I really wanted to do was history. And that wouldn't have happened without the ensuing 30 years of experience.
Wow, wow,
yeah.
Wow. Well, we just saw some cut off.
Lost the light.
But it's okay. It's okay. We'll knock that back in.
Yeah, right.
So lastly, I want to kind of get to the current work that the organization is doing, because I want people to get connected as well.
Yeah, sure.
A large part of this platform is making sure that it's solution-based.
Yes.
And this is still, I guess the word fight is a bad terminology, but it is a fight.
Struggle,
it's
fight.
A struggle, whatever you want to call it. So can you talk to people just about what the organization is currently engaged in and making a push for?
Sure. So we call ourselves now the Virginia Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality. And I would say, the three things that I have mentioned are still sort of at the core of the work. So the Sacred Ground Project, but also the prison justice work, and anti-war work, or anti-imperialism. These are probably the three most important parts of the work that we do, but all of that is also then a part and parcel of focus on community issues. So there's a lot of attention to what's going on in Richmond and communities like Richmond, and issues like housing, employment, just health, a lot, health issues, but and sort of the economics of urban life, right? And so in 2005, we actually started this newspaper. And so it comes out quarterly, the Virginia Defender. You're always going to see something on the front cover that is what we believe is the important thing to focus on, at that moment. So the one you're looking at was followed a prison tribunal, where we brought 150 people together to talk about the issues in prison. Wow. And it was letters from prisoners, some recorded testimonies, family members, and advocates who talked about those issues. And we helped to publicize that. We're affiliated with it's on the back, actually, the Virginia Prison Justice Network.
So we've been running this ad for a long time now in order
Gotcha.
to keep people, know that there's a way to stay connected
Okay.
to organizations that are doing all kinds of aspects of that work.
Hmm.
So that's always going to be, we answer prisoner letters on a regular basis.
Wow.
And sometimes we're able to publish, letters that they write if it represents issues that are shared by a lot of folks.
Wow.
And so, so the newspaper itself is one of our key tools for that. With the Sacred Ground Project, one of our key tools is the annual event that we hold every October. October 10th every year since 2002, since 2002, on that day, to continue to let people know about that story, to invite people to connect to it, which they continue to do. And the anti-war work, we're looking at the fact that resources from our communities get basically siphoned off and used to fund what's happening in Ukraine, the way that it's supporting what's happening to the people of Gaza, the way in which the military budget, gets ratcheted up as money for schools and for real economic development in our communities. It has to be done by nonprofit pilot projects that don't get funded for very long, right? So, looking at and also, by doing all of this, it's not just that everything is wrong. It's not just, that's not it. The point is to unpack the mechanisms, right? Because if you unpack the mechanisms, you make them understandable. And then people can see where they can plug in to do things that will actually make the changes that they want to see made. Not change for change's sake, but change for a purpose, right? And to be as intentional about it as possible. There's a lot about, everything that goes on that seems, overwhelmingly intimidating, but you have to understand it.
Right.
And then once you do, you can do something with it.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing your story and also just the amazing work that you all are doing. And this is, I've been sharing ad nauseum that there have been critiques about just people who participate in social justice movements all over, that it gets exhausting for people, or that it's reminding people kind of brings up certain traumas. But there are things that are very real. And I just really fast, even as I read this, we talk about mass incarceration. Can you shed any light on just some of the issues that are occurring, just privy people to it?
Yes. So, one of the things that has been dealt with a lot, there's also, so disparities in sentencing is a big problem. We're looking at a decision that was made a few years ago, what they call the Fishbeck decision, which had to do with the fact that parole got abolished and sentences used to be dispensed, by jurors or approved by jurors on the basis of the fact that they knew that at some point somebody would be paroled. So they might sentence somebody to 30 years, fully believing that that person was probably going to be paroled in 20 years or in 15 years, right? Good behaviors and all kinds of things like that. But what they found was after they abolished after they abolished parole, at least in Virginia, they were not informing the juries of that. And so they were giving these long sentences that now were going to result in those long sentences. And so that's been a challenge. So the Fishbeck decision has been trying to address that. And so we hear a lot from prisoners who are in prison for crimes that normally would have had much shorter sentences. And instead of getting out, if they were, whether they were stupid enough or they were railroaded enough to do something when they were 19 or 20 years old, instead of getting out when they're 35, and if it was whatever it was, instead of getting out at 35, they're not getting out until they're 55. They're not getting out until they're 60. The world has changed. They have no skills in the world, and the programming is not there. So I'd say one of the other things about the prison system is that programs that are designed to actually help people build skills because they know that they are going to get out someday are very inconsistently and arbitrarily applied. And the public imagination is so easy to wield
or to manipulate. You know, you tell one or two bad stories about people in prison or people who come out of prison, and the money dries up. So any of the programs that we're getting funding will lose funding because it's an easy political pawn. So if somebody wants to win a race, you know, they will take advantage of that and drive that, you know, that kind of activity. So that's one of the kinds of things also that we try to bring attention to, and connect people again to the systems, to the people that they should know about. There are groups who work specifically on legislation, so we try to make sure that those folks are known about as well. And another aspect of it is prisoner education. So what can they get to know? What can they get to learn from the outside, right? What are people doing on the outside that connects to them, that will help them know that they are being thought about, you know, out here, and that there will be something to look to when they come out. There's a lot of activism within prisons that people don't realize, and this attitude that we have is that once someone has been convicted and has gone to prison, that they're really throwaway people. We don't have to think about them anymore. We don't have to consider their feelings anymore, any of that. It's amazing how many mechanisms we have for dehumanizing individual people. And so that work is really, that's important work. All of this work is work. When you talk about, was it struggle, is it fight, it's work. And you know, you need to break from work sometimes too.
Yes.
Right. And so we, part of it is we do this, but we also have to understand when people can't keep up the pace, when people do pull back, and then come back when they're ready, to do work. And then, we hope that this will always be there. We'll see. Yes. We'll see. But the thing about our group is that the Virginia Defenders are all volunteer. It's not a nonprofit. We don't get funding. I mean, the organization was not set up as a nonprofit to get funding from grants and foundations and things like that. We have occasionally benefited from that, but we are a volunteer group, and we are also intentionally multiracial. We also intentionally put a cap on it. We said we would be no more than let me say this right now, no more than 40% other than people of color, right? So because we recognize the society that we live in, right? And we need to be around each other in order to feel comfortable and in order to feel safe and to build trust, right? And so so we've tried to work very intentionally in such a way that that people see us as thoughtful, as trustworthy, as a source with integrity for good information. Because you just need to always have that. And like I said, I don't want anybody running out into the streets based on mythology.
Based on mythology. Right. That's my new quote. I don't want anybody running out into the streets based on mythology.
That's right.
Hub family, again, I'm joined by Anna Edwards. She has just given us amazing food for thought to think about. I'll make sure I put the resources up for you to get connected to, but also just pull a lot away from this conversation. As I always tell you guys, it's the hub, all things for us. I want to make sure that everybody who watches and joins this platform is equipped. And I believe we just got equipped with some new tools and information today to make sure that we're not just listening and hearing, but that we're actually also trying to do. So thank you guys again for participating, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was a blessing. Family, we out, all things for us.